Friends, a few weeks ago, I reflected on the first two chapters of a book by Bishop Michael Curry entitled Love is the Way. And today we get back to that book. We look at chapter 3, in which Michael Curry speaks of his grandmother and how when she was cooking or baking or prepping, she would always tell stories. She was an African American, the daughter of sharecroppers, the granddaughter of former slaves. And she had grown up in a difficult world where every day was a struggle. She went to high school and later taught children in the old country segregated schools. She worked as a domestic, cleaning homes while rearing children and a family. She never went to college, but she did everything in her power to make sure that her children did. She buried some of her own children, including Michael Curry's own mother, and she buried her husband and lost loved ones fighting in the Second World War in segregated units. Bishop Michael Curry writes that times were hard and sometimes dangerous, but he says they always made do with what they had and what life threw at them. He says that was the phrase that his grandmother would always use: we made do. And one expression of making do was his grandmother's ability to cook with whatever she had in her pantry. He says that she could take the grits and make them gourmet. With all sorts of scraps and bits and pieces, she could create a meal for her family that he says tasted like love feels. A meal so delicious that you could forget your troubles, at least while you were at the table. It had been how she had learned to cook from her parents and grandparents who had been slaves. As slaves, they weren't given a lot. They were often given what was not wanted: scraps, otherwise to be thrown away. And part of the genius of cooking with scraps was that folk learned how to make it stretch. They took the proverbial 2 pieces of fish, he says, and 5 loaves of bread and fed a multitude. He says, my ancestors took a little and they made a lot. I get the sense that this would have been true for a lot of people living in Ireland a few generations ago, making do. That was true of my grandmother, my mum's mum. My grandfather was a bricklayer and an alcoholic. Not many of his wages actually made it home. And my grandmother had to learn to make do. Bishop Curry writes that making do is not the same as giving up. It's a way of figuring out how to both survive and thrive. Making do is about taking the scraps of life that might be in front of one and making something new and miraculous out of it, taking an old reality and creating a new possibility. He writes that in the New Testament, there's a passage in which the Apostle Paul reflects on the logic of love. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold on to what is good. And the passage concludes with the words, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. He says this is the methodology, the way, the logic of love. Overcome evil with good. Take their garbage and serve it back gourmet. That is the way of love, he says, that Jesus was teaching and living out in his own life, making do. Michael Curry suggests a recipe for making do. He says the first ingredient for making do is tradition. And by tradition, Michael Curry is referring to tapping into the wisdom of the past. The reason that his grandmother was able to make do, to continuously make the most out of difficult circumstances, is that she had learned to do so from her ancestors, her parents, and her grandparents. When we need guidance on how to live a life grounded in love and guided by love, in other words, making lemon juice when life throws lemons at you, we don't have to start from scratch. He says there already exists a wisdom from people of faith. who have struggled and who have yet made do. Religion at its worst tries to tell us the way something should be done, because it's always been done this way. That is religion at its worst, dogmatic, authoritarian, unable to bend or change or adapt. But Michael Curry suggests that religion at its best should be a treasure chest of wisdom gleaned from the faith journeys of people who have gone before us, like his mother, who learned to cook from scraps and bits and pieces that others would have thrown away. So religion at its best should provide skills for living and loving when life seems to present us with the scraps. Learning to make the most in the midst of difficult circumstances, helping us to keep our eyes focused on the light when it feels like darkness has descended. The second ingredient for making do, he suggests, is imagination. Imagination is crucial if you're going to take life's scraps and turn them into something gourmet, as his grandmother did. He points in this regard to Michelangelo, one of the great artists of the Renaissance. When asked how he was able to produce such amazing sculptures, he would say that the sculpture already existed in the block, or the block of granite. It was simply his job to discover it. And that, says Michael Curry, is imagination. Michael Curry goes on to quote the anonymous saying that problems are solutions in disguise. In the language of psychology, he says it's called reframing, seeing a situation in a new light, from a new angle, and in doing so, finding new inspiration to move forward. The importance of imagination can be found in many of the stories of the Bible, like the story of Moses and the burning bush. And Michael Curry notes that Professor Walter Brueggemann once observed that the movement of liberation for Hebrew slaves in Egypt did not begin when Moses told Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Likewise, it did not begin when the plagues brought their Egyptian slave masters to their knees. Neither did it begin when the waters of the Red Sea were parted, allowing slaves to pass through to freedom on the other side. Michael Curry writes that the freedom movement, led by Moses, begins at the burning bush when God invites Moses to imagine a world without slavery. It begins in the imagination. That's where any movement begins that seeks to help us as humans to become more humane, he says. And so Michael Curry writes that making do begins when someone dares to imagine another possibility, one that is greater than what appears to be the current reality. In Matthew 18, verse 3, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." It was the late Urban Terry Holmes who believed that what Jesus may have been referring to was the fact that children have a wonderful imagination. And likewise, Bishop Curry says, if we are to behold the reign of God, that perfect reign of God's peace, God's shalom, God's salam, what he calls the dream of God, then we need to become like little children and use our imaginations to imagine a new future, to dream a new dream for humanity. The last ingredient for making do, says Michael Curry, is God. Michael Curry writes that he grew up in a community where God was a given. And he acknowledges in the book that not everyone grows up in that way. But within his community, the givenness of God gave people like his grandmother the strength to believe that life could be different, and the constant assurance that whatever struggles or battles they were facing, there was always a possibility that their current circumstances could be disrupted by a power greater than themselves that could work through them. It gave them the ability to look at life with the eyes of hope, that out of sadness, joy could still come, that out of despair, there was always the potential for new possibilities, I think even people who don't have a traditional faith, many people like that have discovered that when they have acted on a moment of inspiration and embarked upon something that seemed bigger than themselves, it seemed like the universe had begun to conspire with them in bringing a new possibility into being, as though there were hidden forces at work, aiding and assisting them. For Michael Curry and the community he grew up in, the language that they used to describe such experiences was the language of God. To believe in God for them was to believe in the possibility of the impossible, that they could tap into a strength beyond their own when life was at its most difficult. And so Michael Curry writes that that's why prayer matters. Prayer matters, he says, because when God or some conception of a higher power is brought into the equation of life, something changes. New possibilities can emerge. Making do requires a little bit of faith, he says, a faith that new possibilities are possible, even when they may seem impossible. Bishop Curry ends the chapter by referring to Howard Thurman, a theologian who made a very big impact on Martin Luther King Jr. Howard Thurman spoke of his own grandmother, who had also been a former slave. She had told of how the slaves would have 2 church services every Sunday. The first service was arranged by the slave master, and the authorized preacher would preach a sermon whose essential purpose was to instruct them on how God would want them to be better slaves. But after the formal service, she used to say that the slaves would then hold their own worship service, and the slave preacher would preach another sermon, one that would always have ended with the words, "You are not slaves, you are the children of God." It was an act of spiritual defiance and spiritual resistance. Michael Curry says that in those words, the old preacher ripped off the givens of a current reality and offered a new possibility. You are not slaves. You are the children of God. Michael Curry writes, no matter what the world and life may say, or how it may make you feel, indeed, we need to all be reminded that we are the children of God. And that essential identity of being children of a higher power of God gives us the energy to make do, to find strength in a power greater than our small selves, and yet which can energize us to take whatever it is that life throws at us and to make do. And not just to make do, but indeed, as Michael Curry says, to make new. Amen. God bless as you continue to think and reflect on these things.